thanks to the NutriSoil team and Rochelle for organising it, and great roll-up. And I was just reflecting, everyone's on a journey on regenerative agriculture, and mine started 20-something years ago when I think we had one little bub and one on the way. And I said to Cassie, my wife, look, mate, I reckon I should toss in this job and go overseas and learn about this holistic management stuff with Alan Savory and come back and start a business. What do you reckon? She said, sure, sounds legit. And that's how we started off. And I think it was a great leap of faith. I think I had youth on the side then. I don't know whether I do it again now. But it's been a great journey, and it's been a privilege for me to work with many landholders over a long period of time. One of the things that I'd like to talk about today briefly is a project that I've been involved with, and I just want to thank Sue Ogilvie, who also has worked with me on this project, because one of the gaps that we have in regenerative agriculture is actually documentation. So when someone says, show me the evidence, it gets a bit, we know it, but it's very hard to prove to those mechanical brains, isn't it, that the evidence is there or exists. So we have lots of case studies, there's lots of stuff in the farmer press. But what we set out to do in this project unashamedly is to present some scientific research, peer-reviewed journal articles published, that shows what happens when people manage in a regenerative way, financially, socially, and on the land. So we have a team of people that's worked with us, and we aim to measure, and we've measured land health across a range of criteria, some of the social impacts of regenerative farming, and boy, there's some real eye-openers there that I'll just touch on today. And we've also looked at the big question, farm profit. Is it profitable? How does it compare? So we've captured a whole range of farmers' experiences. There's 16 farms in our case study. We've gone back up to 17 years on these farms, so it's a long-term study. We've collected the information in a way that our team will be able to publish it in peer-reviewed journals. It's real data from real farms over the long term, it's not modelled data. And we want to compare and contrast regenerative farming to the great unwashed, and we'll leave it at that. So at the moment, we're just at the early stage of producing some of the outcomes, and I'll present some of the interim outcomes. And we're in our final report, writing up stage. So, and I'm going to present the outcomes from the project, and Tim, who's one of the case study farms, is actually going to come and talk about how he's produced some of these outcomes. So I'll talk around some of the theory and the combined outcomes, and Tim will talk his own experiences. So at the moment, we've got 7 really key findings, and the first one there is about the importance of shared goals and priorities. And really, to manage in a regenerative way, you need to have that very clear amongst all the partners. The next thing is we're actually able to measure that land health improves over time. Now, we've all seen that, we've all known that, but actually to document that in a way that can be written up in a journal is very important, and we've been able to do that. One of the fascinating outcomes, and it's great that Charlie and Walter have spoken about it, we've actually been able to survey significant benefits on human health, physical and mental health, through regenerative farming. And that's quite surprising, the differences. Greater confidence and well-being. And don't forget, our surveys were done the end of last year and this year. So I wouldn't say it's superlative seasonal conditions to be doing this sort of work, but even given that, we're able to detect significant differences in confidence and well-being. However, there was a feeling amongst regenerative farmers about a feeling of isolation in their local communities, and this to me is a bit of the downside of being a regenerative farmer, so I'll talk about that in a sec. Here's the big one. Farm profit from the farms that we looked at in the study was comparable to a range of industry benchmarks. There you go. And the last one is, but the profile and the characteristics of a regenerative business is significantly different to a outdoor factory farming business. Okay, so the profit was similar, but the cost structures and the income structures were significantly different. Now, I would love to spend 4 hours on this, but I've got about 15 minutes, so you'll just have to allow me to touch on some highlights, and I'll get to the end where we can get you a bit more information. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of the ecological aspects of that. We used a framework. Our project was in the grassy box woodlands, so we used a established methodology with our project team. Sue McIntyre's work sort of was the foundation for it. And we had 3 PhD students that formed our panel on the ecology, and myself as a bit of a generalist, or a fly in the ointment, or slowing things down. So what we've done is created a little process that we can go onto a farm in about 3 hours, a trained ecologist, and there's a series of templates and checklists that is robust. And we've also been able to use some of the new Landsat technology to track the last 20 years of things like ground cover, which is available. So we've got some really, we can go back in time. It's like Doctor Who. Or does he go forward? I don't know. Anyway, we can go back, that's cool. So we've done that. So we have some really great empirical time series data now, which is really strong, very strong, and some independence in there as well. The fascinating thing is when you go back in time, you can almost see the line at which people changed their management. So it's fascinating. And we're able to classify people in a regenerative. Are people regenerative in their management? Is the land changing? Where are they on a matrix? So we want to be able to say these are regenerative farmers, and we can. So that's important in our study. This is some of the Landsat stuff. There's a property. You probably won't be able to see that in any great detail, but that's okay. But there's a property there, and down the bottom you'll see those squiggly lines. That's right back to about 1993, I think, on that property. And that's plotting 3 important things: ground cover, bare ground, and dead plant material or litter. And the Landsat stuff is able to do that. So we can analyse that on the farm and see the point at which management changed, and we can look at before management changed and after management changed. So it's sort of a bit like a control, isn't it, if you like. Not only that, we can throw a lasso around maybe 5 kilometres and look at, well, how does that property compare to a 5 kilometre locality? And we can look at the differences, and we have sort of another level of control, if you like. So we've got some really nice things we can do with historical data. Because what we can do then is look at these sort of graphs, and the blue column is the rainfall. The highest line is bare ground, and that's bare ground for a 5 kilometre radius around this particular property. And you'll see the bare ground for 5 kilometres around the property is higher than the second line, which is on the actual property. So sometimes it can be 10 or 12% more bare ground on the 5 kilometres around the property. So what this enables us to do is to create some really good, solid empirical information that we can present to say, hey, look at the impacts on the landscape across some key criteria of changing management and the regenerative farming approach before and after, and compared to the locality. So that's kind of neat, and our research panel is writing that sort of information up for the 16 case studies. I just want to very briefly move on to the one of profitability. There's many ways of measuring profitability, but I've just put up one graph just to keep it really simple. We looked at farm profit over time on these case studies using existing and established protocols so that we can establish farm profit, but we've done it in a way that we can compare to the ABARE database and compare to a range of industry databases on farm profit. So it's not just saying, is it profitable? How does it compare across a whole range of criteria, comparing and contrasting to industrial agriculture? And there's lots of info out there. I've just pulled out one snapshot for today, and it's return on assets managed, or return on capital, that a lot of people will be familiar with. We've only looked at profit over the short term, being 10 years, and the decadal profit from the regenerative farmers in our segment was a little bit over 3% return on assets over that period of time, and it was a little bit under 3.5% for that particular database. So it's a little bit lower on profitability, and that's the Holmes and Sackett database. And when you talk to the Holmes and Sackett folks, that's not an industry average by any means. They pride themselves in being the top of the pile in profit. And so to be average, to compare the average of the regenerative farmers in this study with the average of what would be considered a very motivated, profit-driven group of farmers, I'm going to be very bold and say it's in the ballpark. How's that? So is regenerative farming profitable? Well, based on this study, it looks quite profitable, and it's reasonably comparative with conventional agriculture, which is pretty interesting, isn't it? But as I said, it's what that information hides is the profiles of the businesses, how profit is created. The interesting thing here in this graph is the green columns are the aggregated average pasture costs for the whole group, the 16. So you can see there it sits around about 50 cents a DSE in pasture costs for the regenerative farmers. So for a 10,000 DSE property, that's about $5,000 in pasture costs. Now, what that's spent on is totally different for the regenerative farmers compared to the other group of farmers. And it'll be things like soil ameliorants, it could be NutriSoil, it could be compost tea costs, it could be compost costs, it'll be those sort of costs. But it's around about 50 cents a DSE over the time. And you can see for the period of time that we have as a comparative, it's up around $2.50 to $3 a DSE for the industrial approach. So if you've got 10,000 DSEs in the industrial approach, you might spend $25,000 a year on pasture costs. Through regenerative farming, that might be $5,000. So you can see that if you just look at farm profit, it hides some of these things about where are the costs spent. And I could do the same for animal health, I could do the same for a whole range of different costs. That regenerative farming has a significantly lower cost base, which I think also means a significantly lower risk base too, doesn't it? Okay, so again, just for the 15 minutes or 20 minutes I have, we'll move on there, but we could drill down into a whole range of different cost structures, but that's just one of them where it's different. Now this one I am actually very excited about. There's a guy, we're amazed when we started this project, we got a few crumbs out the side of some project from the National Environment Science Project, and we should thank them for funding this project. It was a small project, but we're amazed how many people got on board and provided in-kind support. We've got a number of universities, and ABARE actually got on board, and they're doing some analysis of these figures compared to the ABARE database for us, which is fantastic because people said this research needs to be done. We need to have evidence. And there's a lot of really good folks that sit in those offices there that are really great supporters of regenerative agriculture, but they haven't got the evidence. They don't have that peer-reviewed research papers that answer some of those questions. So they've been great supporters. So we worked with the University of Canberra, and there's a guy there who does a drought index, and he spent his life on this, and I'm not going to try and explain how it's done, but you put in rainfall figures and pattern of rainfall and time of rainfall, and it creates this model of was the season favourable or unfavourable. Now, what you need to look at on that table is the pink is unfavourable and the non-pink is favourable. And people have already picked up something important there, that 9 out of that 13 years were classed as unfavourable. Now this is a very important point, and I think this is where regenerative farming has a wonderful advantage, because folks are not imposing a system of production or a factory on their land. They're looking at what is the land capable and how do we adapt, constantly adapt, daily a business that best suits what's going on physically and ecologically on our land base. So if you adapt a business that's suited for the 9 out of 13 years, you're going to have an awful shock in 4 years, aren't you? Because you're going to have more feed than what you thought. That's good. If you impose a business for the 4 out of 13 years, 9 out of 13 years, you're going to have a horrible shock on the downside. Now, I think that's a major issue there, because I think, unfortunately, industrial farming caters for the average year every year, doesn't it? But we don't have an average year, and we certainly don't have it every year. And I think what's happening is people are underestimating the impact on their land, on the people, and their profitability by what's happening in those 9 out of the 13 years. We're going to spend more time interpreting and analysing a bit more about this, but I thought I'd just put that out there for today. The other thing we looked at is goals. And, you know, agriculture's a funny industry, isn't it? It's very mythical. These rules exist, but what basis is there for them sometimes? I mean, it's a bit like unicorns. We all know they're there, don't we? Well, you know, there's this myth out there that farmers are profit motivated. And, you know, like I do a little bit of work in agriculture for 20 years or 25 years, and I've never subscribed to the fact that farmers are profit motivated. I think people need enough, because you've got to feed your family and pay a bit of debt off and do all of those sort of things and live and educate kids and save for retirement. But in terms of maximising profit, I'm just not sure about that. So what we did is, in this little graph here, we asked the farmers in the group about what were their goals, what were their key goals. There are 22 choices there, and they had to choose 5. So we're asking for a bit of a prioritisation. And then they had to score the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, like voting. And it was really interesting there that if we start from the far right, the 2 highest graphs there are leaving farm in good or better condition and improving biodiversity. They were the 2 most important goals for this subsection of farmers. As we move across to the left, the next most important one is seeing their children in worthwhile occupations, not prescribing what they were, but just making sure their kids were right. And as we come across to the left, you'll see the highest graph, and these first 4 are questions related to profit. The first one is about maximising net farm income. The big one is about getting a satisfactory level of income, and the next 2 are about keeping out of debt and safeguarding. Okay, so the big motivator for this group was actually getting a satisfactory level of income, and that sort of makes sense to me. So don't subscribe to this thing about farmers being profit maximisers. It's about getting a sufficient level of income that you need personally within your family and your whole and your business that creates the level of lifestyle and whatever that you need. And I think that's a big thing that a lot of farmers are seeing, that we've got to maximise income, and it forces them into making decisions that are in someone else's best interest. And when you look at the motivators for regenerative farmers, it's achieving enough. And how much is enough is an individual choice. We worked with Jackie Shermer, who some of you will know, who works at the University of Canberra, and she runs a project called the National Rural Wellbeing Survey, which has, I think, about 10,000 data collections across regional and rural Australia, looking at a whole range of questions. And she's probably Australia's preeminent rural sociologist, social researcher. So we pitched a few questions with Jackie's help from that, so we are able to do a social survey and compare it to the Rural Wellbeing Survey, a very large, well-regarded database. We didn't use the whole thing, we just pulled out a few questions. The blue column at the far left, dark blue, is the response from the regenerative farmers on some of these questions. The next column, the light blue, is the same age group of male farmers. The pink one is the same age group of female farmers, and the last column is all New South Wales farmers. Okay, so in terms of confidence, and there were various questions related to confidence, but you can see there that that group of regenerative farmers were far more confident in their management than the rural wellbeing farmers of similar ages. The other thing is, which was Jackie and Kimberly, who's the PhD student working with Jackie, who's using this in her PhD, is health. One of the really surprising things that came out of this survey is the health of the regenerative farmers, physical and mental health, was off the dial healthier compared to the rural wellbeing survey for the same ages and genders. Off the dial. And they got very excited about that. And they're planning to do more research to work out why is that the case. But that really, I reckon that's the fundamentally important thing, that folks that manage in a regenerative way are physically healthier from this survey and are also mentally healthier. Now that's got to be a good thing for rural Australia, doesn't it? And to actually think that, without going off too far off the story that I'm trying to outlay, but isn't it interesting that when we think around the causes of mental health, we're in a drought at the moment, but wouldn't it be interesting if someone actually thought, is the farming system creating some of these problems, or is it the drought? Because these folks did this survey in pretty tough seasonal conditions too, and the drought is not impacting them to the same level that it is out there to the general population. Why is that? One can surmise, or you could assume, or maybe just put it out there as an idea. Maybe there's something to do with the way in which they farm that creates a level of resilience physically and mentally. Wellbeing, again, across the whole range of criteria, the differences in the regenerative farmers was that they were significantly more confident in their own management as it came to managing their land and seasonal conditions and managing their businesses. And that's important, I think. However, the downside is, we've spoken about it, that if you go to the far right, some of the downsides of being involved in regenerative farming is that feeling of isolation from the local community. And we've all felt that. And I think these days, like today, are fantastic because what's happened is regenerative farmers have sought out their own regenerative farming communities. And folks, these very cool people up the back sitting next to me are from Toowoomba. Now, that's a pretty fair drive, isn't it? To come down this far for a day to hang out with really cool regenerative farmers. And that's what happens, I think, is people seek out different networks, and that's been happening. So days like today, networks like today are so important for regenerative farming because a lot of people don't get that local support. In fact, they feel excluded, not included. Now again, I'm going off script here, and I know Jackie Shermer would hammer me, but the point is, isn't that a sad indictment of agriculture, that people feel excluded from their local communities, not on the fact that they're good people or not good people, or good-hearted or not-hearted, but the technique of farming? Okay, now, so that's sort of getting towards the end of my time, but the next steps for our project is we're just writing it up over the next 3 weeks. We're going to be running some regional workshops, which will be probably more like 3 or 4 hours overview and a bit more than what I can show you today. But I really wanted to let you know that this information is coming out there. There are 3 planned research publications, and we'll be making 3 to 4 page PDFs on different topics. And we'll be running some workshops for people that want to come along there too. We're also going and trying to rattle the cages for stage 2, because the limitations of this study aren't the way in which the research is being done, it's the size of the sample. So we'd like to replicate this and get more people into this database over time, and we'd like to try it in different states too, because we've got a fairly easy way now of collecting financial, social and ecological data. That takes hours, not days. So that's the next step for us too. If anyone wants Sue or myself to come along and present to groups, we can do that after probably August. And I'm just going to hand it across to Tim in a sec to talk about, Tim being one of the farmers, just to talk about a little bit more about some of the practicalities and how to. He's been managing regeneratively for a while, but I want to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. Conventional wisdom is that good land management must come at a cost to profit. Now, I think that's mechanical-minded thinking, isn't it? This is a different approach. So I think this research like this is showing that you can have both. You can have good land management and it doesn't have to come at a cost to profit. I think the other thing is that was quite surprising for us is the difference that regenerative grazing could actually be healthier for people, mentally and physically, and could actually be easier for people too, because one of the information is we looked at hours worked, and the hours worked per week from regenerative farmers was less than traditional agriculture in those big databases. You're working less hours, you're physically weller, and you're mentally weller too. And your profit's in the ballpark. And your land's improving. Not a bad story, is it? So yeah, it's possible that land health can improve at the same time that you can achieve a satisfactory level of profit. And a meaningful way of life is created and led by the people. Because that's another outcome from the surveys. People felt they had a purposeful, meaningful life. That's a very protective factor for mental health and anxiety type issues. So look, it's great to be able to document, and we'll publish some of this, and we should give thanks to, it's not me doing this research, I'm just the fly in the ointment, or the slower downer of it sometimes, but we've had a really good high level team. We've had good panels for the ecologists, good panel of people for economists, and good support from a range of universities, state government departments and federal departments on this. So it will be coming out soon, so just keep an eye on it, and we're planning quite a significant media blitz for it. But what I'd like to do now is hand it across to Tim, who will lift the quality of the presentations by giving us a bit of an overview to his experiences as a regenerative farmer over time, and talk a few more of the practicalities and the how-to that creates these sort of outcomes.
Thank you, Mark, for those words of, and I think you'll all find that was very stimulating. And being part of the, being privileged to be part of that steering committee, looking at the social implications and the results is we're breaking new ground. And what you've heard today from what Mark just presented is something very, well, it's very new, and it's on the upward from here on in, because we do have the results. And yes, I was the guinea pig when I first started back 35 years ago, and I was the village idiot, literally. No one really wanted to talk about it, and I just sort of talked about the weather and the weather and the weather, and that's about it. We didn't talk about what I was doing until a few others came on the scene. But I'd also like at this stage to acknowledge Terry McCosker, who's here, and the guys who taught Terry and myself and others back in those early days, Stan Parsons and Alan Savory. We were the lucky ones. We were sort of the guinea pigs when they first came to Australia. Stan was first, and then Alan shortly followed. And Alan being the, Stan being the economist, he pointed out a few basic things, and I'll just mention two of them because they're the two that sort of sat on my mind and stimulated me, and hopefully these two things will stimulate everyone in here to sort of think along the same lines. The first one was to do with the three-legged pot, and he just drew this thing up on a whiteboard, and he had three legs underneath, and he said one of those legs is environmental, one's economic, and the other's social, and the pot is always tipping, and in that pot is the business, it's us, and how we operate it, and we've got to keep those legs as level as we can, even though we're in drought, floods, and everything else that Mother Nature throws at us. So that sat with me, and I thought, yeah, well, my pot's tipping into all different directions, and it's interesting that Mark has brought these points out, because it's the first time that on that social level we don't really talk that much because it's too touchy-feely. And what Charles has pointed out in his book brings a lot of that out, because we do have to address it. It's not a touchy-feely thing anymore, because our lives, our health and everything is affected. And so the other point which Stan sort of pointed out was the fact that most of our costs of production are land and labour related. And I thought, yeah, okay. And he said, well, you can drop that by about 70%. And everyone just looked at themselves and thought, no way that could ever happen. And that's basically what I have done over the 35 years. It's not something that happens overnight, but I had a goal, and then and that didn't happen until I really learned. I came back and learned from Alan Sobey about the value of a holistic goal, and having to be able to sit down, look at your values with your partner, your business partners, or whoever, and move forward from there, and make decisions about whatever you're doing. Because what Alan was trying to point out is that what we do every day is make a decision, right? So we walk out the door and we make a decision to do something, whether it's to spray the paddock or put NutriSoil on. I'll have to throw that one in. Whatever that decision is, there's always a result from that, isn't there? And so that comes back to the fact that, yes, we are scientists, because when we walk out the door, we are conducting an experiment. I'm conducting an experiment. Every time I walk out the door to do something, I've made a decision and I've conducted an experiment. But what I didn't learn so much then was to monitor, how to monitor, and to read the land. And so that message is really quite obvious here today. And it's a weak, one of the parts of decision making is you look at the weak link in the chain. Where's the weakest link? And in this case, what I'm talking about here is the ability to make a decision that's going to lead us towards our goal, and to address the issues that's affecting us, and to look at the log jams, and to look at another thing called cause and effect. Are we treating the cause, or are we treating the symptom? Quite often we're not treating the cause at all. So I'll just go through a few of the things. I'm just showing you here a few shots of what the property looks like. It was coarse granite country west of Uralla when my father took it up back in 1952. And a little story there, if I've got a few minutes to just say it. It was bought in my grandfather's time after the Korean War, and when wool was so-called very good, pound to pound. Now, he had the foresight to say, okay, well, we've got some wool on the ground here because there was liver fluke and barber's pollen, you name it, dead sheep everywhere. So he gathered together some folk to pick up on Hessian bags, picked up all the dead wool, and within 12 months, half the property was paid for. How many of you could do that today? That's bringing back reality of the value of a product relative to our cost of production. So even though wool, and we were very lucky this year, we got a very good price for our superfine wool, because I hung in there with it and it's rewarded me. But it's still not up there compared to our costs. So our terms of trade is really what I'm getting at here. That was the key factor for me to change. That was the bottom line. Our cost of production still going up, and our returns struggling along in behind. And so I had to make some decisions, and so I was really grateful for the benefits of the RCS and HM thinking in more ways than one. And all I'm trying to do here is just demonstrate that there is some really positive thinking out there, and it's going to lead us, not only lead Australia but lead the world if we can really embrace it a lot more. That's just a bit of a history of the property and the whole ecosystem functions. The map there is really showing, if I've got it up screen, yep, that was showing how I subdivided the land, and it was subdivided relative to the landscape, not according to a wagon wheel or that sort of thing. I didn't like going down that concept because I wanted to get my sheep camps down lower, basically that was the issue, was I had thistles, and I used to go around spraying with 2,4-D with little sheep camps with a Fergie tractor. No way will I do that again. So I fenced the landscape to on a parallel, basically, not a vertical line, so that I could draw the nutrients down, and I was experimenting how that would work. And then I ended up with, I think there's 6 farmlets. I call them farmlets because that's what we are. We're farm managers, so I'll call each one a farmlet. And then I just kept fencing, and now we're up to 310 paddocks. Now, within those, I have strategies so that I can have what I call a leader follower. The cattle are always in front of the sheep, and that way they can handle the bulk grass and the sheep follow in behind. And then if I have a bigger season, or what I call a 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock I've got one mob, 6 o'clock I've got another, if it's fast growth time. And I can actually have double the carrying capacity in that period simply by using that same grazing regime that's there. And it's just an adjustment on the head here, and all you're doing, or I bring on adjustment stock, which I do. They're a big part of our operation. We have destocked at the moment by 55% to allow for this drought period. And that was all done starting in December, January. 30% of that was adjustment stock. So it didn't hurt me to do that. It was just a phone call, bang, they're gone. And then I started cutting into the stock, castor ages, etc., as we know. So what I used to do was this sort of thing. I'm not into that now. Haven't been for many years and never will be. In fact, one of the biggest problems I had was the existing hay sheds that were on the property. And this might sound very hard hitting for some people who are in the middle of a drought who's feeding out a lot of hay. But I stopped feeding hay nearly close to 30 years ago, and I haven't fed any grain either. So how have I done that? And it was a gradual transition, as I'll show on a graph later. That happened because the landscape was improving, and I had a grazing plan, and which I didn't have before. It wasn't, and this is the difference between rotational grazing and a holistic plan grazing effect, because a grazing plan allows you to plan right out to a year and a half or even 2 years if you really want it, if you're serious about it. And my 2-year period would mean that I would then combine my farmlets, increase the number of paddocks from 40 odd up to 80, 90 paddocks, 2 to 3 day graze period. I've suddenly got a 6 months rest or more. And that's flexibility within it. So this is the benefits of it. And so people say, well, you couldn't afford to. How could I afford to do all that fencing? Well, the highest return on capital for me has always come from wire and poly pipe. When in 94, 95, when people were coming out like they are now with truckloads of hay and grain, I was coming back with wire and poly pipe. I was fencing ahead, even though it was drought time. So you can do it. There's no such thing as, oh no, I've got to wait for rain or whatever. You can get yourself going, and and the return on capital on that was within 2 years. That was my aim. Every time I put something in, some infrastructure, I made sure that I got it 100% back within 2 years. Generally it was 1, because I had more rest. That was how I got it back. The longer the rest period, the better it worked. And the more organic matter, the more humus, better the water cycle. Everything that's been talked about this morning, it all just flows. So this shot is showing the back in 82, and I'm doing a comparison to now. That was when I wasn't making the right decision. I thought I was making the right decision. Everyone say, oh yes, well, the real issue there is the drilling rig. Well, no, it's not. The real issue is the bare ground. Because that is showing now, that photograph was taken only a few weeks ago, and we're actually in a drier period now than back in 82. We're far drier period now. For our region, it's a 750 mil average in rainfall, and we've had less than 100 mils so far in the first 6 months of this year. And that's the amount of grass we've got left there. And that's midwinter now, and what I've got is a solar unit on that spring, and that dam is where the drilling rig was. I actually went straight through and didn't get enough water, so I put a well in, and it went down 2 lengths of pipe, 8 foot, and it's still trickling out over the top of that well into that dam, and I'm pumping with a solar unit. Now, that is an indicator of a good water cycle. I don't want to brag too much about it, but it's so important. And that wouldn't happen if I had years and years of bare ground beforehand. The water, the hydrology of the land has improved. And that is resilience. You know, we talk about resilient agriculture and whatever. That is a tremendous indicator to me that I just thought maybe it'll dry up, but no, it's actually running faster at the moment than what it was earlier. So Mark talked about research and data. Fortunately, our property is near the University of New England, and the botany department there, and only the botany department, were very good at picking up on what we were doing. And I have to acknowledge Professor Whaley from the University at New England, and he's a native pasture guru. And he was the one who introduced me, and he said, you've got to keep thinking about your natives, you've got to learn about your natives. And so, anyway, this is where Christine Jones, that's her vehicle there, she did the first work, I think it was the first research work ever done in Australia on regenerative type agriculture. And so we had a land care funding, thank God for land care, because it wouldn't have happened otherwise. We got a grant for our district to monitor 5 different properties in our region, and we were one. And what we were looking at, the result from this was an increase in pin rush or juncus. Now, as a result, 3 years later, it turned out that it was due to bare ground. What's new? The bare ground was allowing these plants to come through, and you can see the amount of bare ground there. So I'll just go on to this one in time frame. This is showing a comparative with dandelion and where it's been grazed. So the paddock on the right showing the dandelions, and that was about 3 weeks after the sheep had been through. And there was this agronomist who came out to me and said, Tim, no, you've got to pour the lime on, and you've got to spray all that grass out and get into the improved pastures at greater cost. Well, I'm sorry, but fortunately I didn't do that. This is in our back country that's never had superphosphate as a matter of interest. Never been touched, and it still hasn't. It's still a la natural. It's more biodiverse than the rest of the property. But it's demonstrating that the sheep actually made use of that dandelion, because it's a deep-rooted perennial and high in value in protein, and yet we think of it as a weed. So here we are with African lovegrass. So this was just taken recently next to a water tank. That's why it's a bit next to a water trough. That's why it's probably grazed down. But the African lovegrass, I gave a talk at Tenterfield recently because that's their big issue up there. We see that as a weed, but it's not. It's a damn good plant, and I reckon I could double our carrying capacity just purely by managing that grass better. High intensity stock grazing. And they made use of that, and that's just after a couple of -5 frosts, which we've had, and it's still green. So all these are showing that, a different way of thinking. So this is still part of that research which Christine did, showing the transects there, and it's just showing the difference on the left-hand side between the control and conventional agriculture, and that was hard to do, very frustrating for me, to actually keep those paddocks and try and run them the same old way, and compared to the planned grazing approach. But you can see just the amount of litter that's there, and we had 5 or 10 mils of rain. That's why the left-hand side is showing a bit greener. And so these are the other results that came through from that research as well, showing the change in cool season perennials and warm season. The big change, this is where native pastures, we really missed the boat. I'm sorry, but I have a lot of time for Bruce Pascoe in his book, The Dark Emu. He refers to native pastures all the time. Well, why wouldn't he? Because he wouldn't know what a Phalaris plant looked like back then. But the natives, we are blessed by the huge amount of seed which we have in our soil. And talking to Ian Hegarty, and I'm sure Di would talk about this earlier, a bit later, the amount of new grass that they've got, and they're on a much drier rainfall than we are, and yet he's got grasses coming up, native grasses. Really pleasing to hear. We do have them, it's just that we haven't allowed ourselves to manage the land to get them to come back. And the other problem is that we haven't learned to monitor those, to read that land, to know what grasses we are, to what is Elemus, you know? It's a cool season perennial of wheatgrass. What is Microlina? What is all Poetustic? What is Danthonia? They're all beautiful grasses, nothing wrong with them at all. So why the hell are we out there spraying them? You go to Walker, you go to country there, it makes me squirm when I see the amount of Roundup that goes out on that country, and nearly every one of those, I'm not having a go at too much at the Holmes and Sackett's, but you know, they're in there for the high input. It's got to be high input. Well, you look, talk to them now, they'll be hiding in their holes at the moment because there's nothing but dirt, those paddocks where they've sown down. Nothing but dirt. And they've got nothing to go through, and if we hit a dry spring, they're in big trouble. It'll be hands out time, and it's their own fault. It's not, you know, that is their own fault, but it's also a problem, I think, to do with the corporate bodies. Those, you know, the big fellas out there selling the product, and they're at fault for looking at that, for going down that track. So we had another research program done. This is just going to be released soon, by Rachel Lawrence at the UNE Botany Department, and she was studying the relationship between organic matter and insect life. And these are parasitic wasps, and we have about 8 or 10 major species she found there. And she compared this, she did it over a number of properties on the Northern Tablelands, and she compared it to the control, which was the same, you know, not regenerative ag farming practices. And there's a dramatic increase just between here and the wall there, between species, you know, the number of parasitic wasps. And so they're a very important part of it. You know, we talk about problems with sheep. Oh yeah, we get fly problems, we have all these issues. No, we don't have a real issue there because the parasitic wasp eats the larvae. They're part of the system. It's no different to the wolf spiders. You know, they're all these parts, the ecology of our environment, they're vital. So this is really good data, you know. For Australians, we should be proud of ourselves to have this data because it just hasn't been available. And we can say scientifically that it does work. And so this is showing, this is the challenge, this graph, when it came out when Christine and Judy put their, Judy Earl, who's now a holistic management educator as well. So it's interesting with the journey of these two girls, when they started with us and where they are now. But this is showing the change in phosphorus and calcium of our soil. And that happened within 2 to 3 years of me putting the wire and polypiping. Dramatic change. And that was a few years ago, obviously, but it's still the same. We've gone back and monitored at that level, and it hasn't dropped. It's actually held up at that level, the phosphorus. So we haven't actually applied lime or phosphorus or whatever. That's one of the things that guided me. So I'm just showing here, at the bottom of this slide is the regeneration. Now that's another indicator. We've got masses of trees after the 2016 wet period, which most of us had been through, fortunately. I used to say I was skiing into the lodge, you know, on the motorbike because it was that wet. But we got a result of that was a massive increase in regeneration of new trees, particularly Blakely's red gum. And so that was a great result. There's some pockets because it came back too thick, where I might go out and thin them out a bit with a herbicide. And then at the top there, I'm showing a tree that was pollarded because mistletoe is a problem, and mistletoe has come in, and that was in one area of our property, only one, where our airstrip used to be. And I'll say used to because I've fenced it off nearly 20 years ago. And incidentally, this is the paradigm thinking. When I fenced that airstrip off, I made sure that I was going to open that again. And so I had an end assembly one end of where the airplane would fly through, and another end assembly, and I had a portable fence so I could pull it down. That's now a permanent fence. So obviously I haven't used the airstrip. But the result of that was that we had to cut all the trees down, stop the aeroplanes from hitting the trees. So anyway, we've had to pollard these trees because they were isolated, they weren't in balance with each other, and mistletoe was on its rise. And so there's another story in that. I'm just showing the riparian area. We don't need to fence off, like some people say, you've got to fence off. I don't think it's necessary. Rest is the factor here. 95% of our land is rested. so we don't have to all the time, so you don't need to fence it off. There's dung beetle activity showing here, the return of nutrients. Little simple thing here, we supplement, we don't substitute, and that's a great thing that we've got to work on. Like we use Himalayan salt, and I've got some brochures out there on the table there which I use. Costs about 40-50 cents a DSE per annum, very cheap. And this graph is showing the, it follows on from Mark's graph really, the rainfall and the stocking rate, and we haven't fed. The only thing I've used is bypass protein for autumn cows and calves because they're milking at the moment, and when we calve in spring we'll maybe use some more. So I'm just showing there very quickly, that's the grazing plan. If you want to learn more about it, we go to our school and we learn more about how to do this, an open plan, closed plan, and it guides you to wherever you are. In Victoria, that graph is different, obviously, because of the rainfall. Livestock are our tools, and we manage the full range of species. That's really what I'm trying to say here. We manage for the full range. Don't ever manage for one individual species. It doesn't work that way. So the environmental debate, if you just quickly read that one. Education before regulation. That's really my concept. We've got to get away from this regulatory body that we have, and we've got to move on. And on that line, I'm very interested and I've had this concern about where we're heading and the lack of education. I went through Orange Ag College, and I think it was a disgrace that place ever closed as an agricultural learning site. And hopefully we'll get something back there again, not there but somewhere else. But I think there's a need for a regenerative ag institute so that all bodies come together. We don't need to be independent on our, we're thinking along the same line, and I think we've got to link up with the city folk, and there's a great avenue for them to be part of this, because as was pointed out by Walter and Charles, human health is the bottom line here, and we are responsible whether we like it or not. Thank you.